In 633 AD, on a fog-shrouded marsh in Yorkshire, the most powerful Christian king in Britain made his final stand against a vengeful alliance of pagan and nominally Christian forces, and our silver-armoured good knight stood witness as King Edwin of Northumbria fell beneath the spears of his enemies in a battle that would reshape the very soul of early medieval England. As Edwin, the mighty Bretwalda, who had united kingdoms and spread the Christian faith across the northern lands, faced the combined fury of Cadwallon ap Cadfan of Gwynedd, a man driven by revenge, and Penda of Mercia, a pagan warlord hungry for power. This wasn't merely another territorial dispute, but a collision of faiths, ambitions, and ancient grudges that would determine whether Christian Northumbria would continue its dominance or crumble into chaos. Watch as our immortal knight witnesses the moment when personal vengeance and political opportunism converged to destroy a kingdom, when the marshlands of Hatfield Chase became a graveyard for royal ambitions, and when the death of one man triggered the temporary collapse of an entire realm. From Edwin's desperate final charge to Cadwallon's brutal ravaging of the defeated kingdom, every moment of this epic tale reveals how quickly power could shift in the violent world of 7th century Britain. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to history's most pivotal battles, where our eternal knight in silver armor guides you through the rise and fall of kingdoms with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which early medieval battle you'd like the good knight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that fateful October day in 633 AD, when a Christian king's reign ended in the cold waters of a Yorkshire marsh. The Battle of Hatfield Chase, 633 AD. A Good Knight Story. Chapter 1. The Weight of Silver. The morning mist clung to the marshlands like the breath of ancient spirits, and the good knight felt the familiar weight of his silver armor as he stood among Edwin's warriors in the grey dawn of October 12th, 633 AD. The metal was cold against his skin, each plate and mail link carrying the memory of countless battles, countless kings who had risen and fallen while he remained. Around him, 3,000 Northumbrian warriors shifted restlessly in the pre-battle silence, their spear points catching what little light filtered through the fog. The good knight had seen Edwin grow from an exiled prince into the most powerful ruler in Britain, had watched him unite the fractured kingdoms of Bernicia and Dara into a single, mighty realm. He had stood beside the king during his baptism 6 years earlier, had witnessed the moment when the pagan overlord knelt before Bishop Paulinus and accepted the Christian faith. Now, as he gazed across the treacherous terrain of Hatfield Chase, the good knight wondered if this marshy ground would become Edwin's tomb. The landscape stretched before them like a trap laid by the gods themselves. To the north, the wetlands extended into an impenetrable maze of reed beds and standing water. To the east, the River Don curved through the lowlands, its banks soft and treacherous. The ground beneath their feet squelched with each step, and the good knight could feel his horse's hooves sinking slightly into the boggy earth. This was not ground for cavalry charges or grand maneuvers. This was a place where men would die slowly, struggling in the mire. Edwin sat astride his war horse nearby, his own armor gleaming despite the grey morning. At 48 years old, the king bore the weathered face of a man who had fought his way from exile to supremacy. His eyes, sharp and calculating, surveyed the battlefield with the intensity of a predator. The good knight had seen that look before, in the moments before Edwin's greatest victories. But today, something was different. There was a tension in the king's shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of a man who sensed the weight of fate pressing down upon him. "They come from the west," Edwin murmured to his war chiefs, his voice carrying the authority that had made him Bretwalda over much of Britain. "Cadwallon seeks his revenge for Anglesey, and Penda seeks to break our power forever." The good knight remembered the siege of Anglesey, when Edwin's forces had driven Cadwallon from his stronghold and forced the Welsh king into humiliating exile. That victory had seemed complete at the time, another jewel in Edwin's crown of conquests. But exile had not broken Cadwallon. It had forged him into something harder, more dangerous. And now he returned with the pagan Penda at his side, their unlikely alliance bound together by a shared hatred of Northumbrian dominance. As the mist began to thin, the good knight caught his first glimpse of the enemy. They emerged from the western approaches like shadows given form, their lines stretching across the firmer ground beyond the marsh. 1,800 warriors, fewer than Edwin's host, but moving with a purpose that spoke of careful planning and desperate determination. At their head rode two figures that made the good knight's hand instinctively move to his sword hilt. Cadwallon ap Cadfan sat his horse like a man possessed by fury. Even at this distance, the good knight could sense the rage that burned within the Welsh king. This was no longer the proud ruler who had once held court in Gwyned's halls. This was a man transformed by defeat and exile into an instrument of vengeance. Beside him rode Penda, and though the Mercians' exact status remained unclear to many, the good knight recognized the bearing of a true war leader. Whether king or powerful warlord, Penda commanded respect through strength of arm and cunning of mind. The sight of these two together sent a chill through the good knight that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had witnessed many alliances in his long existence, but few as dangerous as this union of Christian vengeance and pagan ambition. Cadwallon brought the fury of a wronged king and intimate knowledge of Edwin's tactics. Penda brought the rising power of Mercia and a warrior's instinct for exploiting weakness. Together, they represented everything that threatened Edwin's carefully constructed hegemony. Edwin raised his hand, and the Northumbrian host began to move forward, their feet splashing through the shallow water that covered much of the battlefield. The good knight urged his own mount forward, feeling the animal's reluctance as its hooves found uncertain purchase on the boggy ground. Around him, the other warriors struggled with the same difficulty, their formation beginning to stretch and waver as the terrain imposed its will upon their movements. The good knight thought of the path that had led to this moment. Edwin's reign had been marked by expansion and consolidation, by the spread of Christian faith and Northumbrian power. The king had conquered Elmet, had extended his influence to the Irish Sea, had made himself overlord of kingdoms from the Humber to the Forth. But every conquest had created new enemies, every expansion had stretched his resources thinner. And now, in this desolate marsh, all of Edwin's achievements would be tested against the combined fury of those he had defeated. As the two armies drew closer, the good knight could see the individual faces of the enemy warriors. There was something different about them, something that spoke of men who had nothing left to lose. These were not the comfortable soldiers of a secure kingdom, but the desperate followers of exiled kings and ambitious warlords. They moved with the fluid grace of men accustomed to fighting on difficult ground, their weapons held with the easy familiarity of those who lived by the sword. The morning air carried the sound of their approach, the splash of feet through water, the creak of leather and metal, the low murmur of voices speaking in Welsh, and the harsh consonants of Mercian dialect. The good knight's horse snorted and tossed its head, sensing the tension that filled the air like the promise of a storm. All around him, Edwin's warriors tightened their grips on spear and sword, their eyes fixed on the approaching enemy. Edwin himself had fallen silent, his gaze locked on the two kings who rode at the head of the opposing host. The good knight wondered what thoughts passed through the Northumbrian king's mind in these final moments before battle. Did he think of his Christian faith, of the God he had embraced 6 years earlier? Did he remember his wife Ethelberga, safe in her chambers, or his sons who would inherit his kingdom? Or did his mind turn to the tactical challenges ahead, to the problem of fighting an outnumbered but determined enemy on ground that favored neither side? The distance between the armies continued to shrink, and the good knight could now make out the details of individual weapons and armor. The enemy carried a mix of equipment that spoke to their diverse origins: Welsh spears and shields alongside Mercian swords and axes. The gear of professional warriors mingled with the simpler arms of farmers and craftsmen called to war. But there was nothing simple about the way they moved, nothing amateur about their formation. These men had been welded into an effective fighting force by the shared purpose of their leaders. As the final yards disappeared between the two hosts, the good knight felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always preceded battle. His silver armor seemed to grow heavier, each piece settling into its accustomed place as his body prepared for the violence to come. His sword, worn smooth by centuries of use, felt perfectly balanced in his hand. His shield, bearing the scars of 1,000 encounters, rested easily on his arm. The moment stretched like a bowstring drawn to its limit, the two armies poised on the edge of collision. The good knight could hear Edwin's breathing, quick and controlled, could sense the king's final calculations as he weighed the odds and prepared to commit his forces to battle. Around them, 3,000 Northumbrian warriors waited for the word that would send them forward into the chaos of combat. And in that suspended instant, as the mist continued to lift and the pale sun struggled to break through the clouds, the good knight knew that he was about to witness something more than just another battle. This was a moment when the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance, when the death of a single man could reshape the political landscape of an entire island. Whatever happened in the next few hours would echo through the halls of history, and he would be there to see it all. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft splash of water and the distant cry of marsh birds. Then Edwin's voice rang out across the battlefield, clear and commanding despite the weight of the moment. "For Northumbria, for Christ, forward!" And with those words, the Battle of Hatfield Chase began. The good knight's horse lunged forward as Edwin's battle cry echoed across the marsh, and suddenly the world exploded into motion and sound. 3,000 Northumbrian warriors surged ahead through the shallow water, their war cries mixing with the splash of feet and hooves, the rattle of mail, and the whistle of arrows beginning to arc through the morning air. The good knight felt his mount's muscles bunch and release beneath him as the animal fought for purchase on the treacherous ground, each stride sending up sprays of muddy water that caught the weak sunlight like scattered jewels. To his left, Edwin rode with the controlled fury of a king who had spent his life fighting for survival. The Northumbrian monarch's spear was leveled toward the enemy, his shield held high, his face set in the grim mask of a warrior who knew that this battle would determine not just his own fate, but the future of his entire kingdom. Behind him rode his son Osfrith, young and eager, his armor bright and his eyes blazing with the confidence of youth. The good knight had seen that look before, in the faces of countless young warriors who believed themselves invincible. He wondered if Osfrith would live to see the sun set. The enemy line was moving too, but not in the wild charge that the good knight had expected. Instead, Cadwallon and Penda's forces advanced with disciplined precision, their formation holding steady despite the difficult terrain. The good knight could see the tactical intelligence behind their movement. They were using the firmer ground to their advantage, forcing Edwin's men to come to them through the worst of the marsh. It was a subtle trap, and Edwin was walking directly into it. The first arrows began to fall among the Northumbrian ranks, their iron points seeking gaps in armor and shield walls. The good knight heard the wet thud of a shaft, striking flesh somewhere behind him, followed by a man's scream of pain and rage. But the Northumbrian advance continued, driven by momentum and the desperate need to close with the enemy before the marsh could claim too many victims. As the distance shrank to mere yards, the good knight could see individual faces in the enemy ranks. There was Cadwallon himself, his features twisted with a hatred so pure it seemed to burn like cold fire. The Welsh king's eyes were fixed on Edwin with an intensity that spoke of years of planning, years of dreaming of this moment of revenge. His spear was already bloodied, whether from some earlier skirmish or from his own ritual preparation, the good knight could not tell. Beside Cadwallon rode a figure that the good knight recognized as one of Penda's war chiefs, a grizzled veteran whose scarred face spoke of decades of warfare. The man's eyes held none of Cadwallon's personal fury, but rather the cold calculation of a professional killer. This was a man who fought not for revenge or glory, but for the simple pleasure of victory and the rewards it brought. In some ways, the good knight found such men more dangerous than those driven by passion. They made fewer mistakes. The collision, when it came, was like the meeting of two storm fronts. The good knight's horse crashed into the enemy line with bone-jarring force, his spear taking a Welsh warrior in the chest and lifting the man from his feet. The impact sent shockwaves up the good knight's arm, but his grip held firm as he drove the point deep into his opponent's body. Around him, the air filled with the crash of weapons on shields, the screams of wounded men and horses, and the wet sounds of steel parting flesh. The good knight released his spear and drew his sword in one fluid motion, the blade singing as it cleared the scabbard. A Mercian warrior lunged at him with an axe, the weapon's head gleaming with fresh blood. The good knight turned the blow with his shield and struck back, his sword finding the gap between the man's helmet and mail shirt. The warrior dropped without a sound, his blood mixing with the marsh water at the GoodKnight's horse's feet. But even as he fought, the GoodKnight could sense that something was wrong with the Northumbrian attack. The charge that should have broken the enemy line was instead becoming bogged down in the literal sense. Edwin's warriors were struggling against the terrain as much as against their human opponents. Horses were slipping and falling in the mud, their riders thrown into the water where they became easy targets for enemy spears. Men on foot found their movement slowed by the boggy ground, their formations breaking apart as they struggled to maintain their footing. The GoodKnight caught a glimpse of Edwin through the chaos, the king still mounted but surrounded by a press of enemy warriors. Osfrith was beside his father, his sword red to the hilt, but the GoodKnight could see that the young prince was tiring. The initial fury of the charge was giving way to the grinding attrition of close combat, and in such fights, experience and endurance mattered more than youthful enthusiasm. A spear thrust came at the GoodKnight from his blind side, and he barely managed to deflect it with his shield. The point scraped along his silver armor, leaving a bright scratch in the metal, but failing to penetrate. He wheeled his horse toward his attacker, a young Welsh warrior whose face was painted with blue woad in the ancient manner. The boy, for he could not have been more than 16, raised his spear for another thrust, but the GoodKnight's sword took him in the throat before he could complete the motion. As the boy fell, the GoodKnight felt the familiar weight of taking a young life. In his long existence, he had killed more men than he could count, but the young ones always affected him most. This Welsh boy had probably been a farmer or shepherd before the call to war had reached his village. Now he would never see another harvest, never marry, never hold children of his own. Such was the price of king's ambitions. The battle was spreading out across the marsh, breaking into dozens of smaller combats as the organized formations dissolved into chaos. The GoodKnight could see pockets of Northumbrian warriors fighting desperately against superior numbers, their shields locked together as they tried to hold their ground. But the enemy was everywhere, seeming to emerge from the mist like demons summoned from the depths of the marsh itself. Through the melee, the GoodKnight caught sight of Penda himself, the Mercian war leader cutting through Edwin's men with methodical efficiency. There was nothing flashy about Penda's fighting style. He simply killed with the workmanlike precision of a master craftsman. His sword rose and fell in steady rhythm, each stroke finding its mark with deadly accuracy. Men fell before him like wheat before the scythe, and the GoodKnight could see the fear beginning to spread through the Northumbrian ranks as word of the Mercian's prowess passed from warrior to warrior. The GoodKnight spurred his horse toward a group of Edwin's men who were being pressed back toward a particularly treacherous section of the marsh. Their leader, a grizzled thane whose grey beard was matted with blood, was shouting orders even as he parried a series of vicious axe blows. The GoodKnight's arrival turned the tide of that small engagement, his sword taking 2 of the attackers before they realized the danger. But even as he fought to save these men, he could see that the larger battle was slipping away from Edwin's forces. The tactical situation was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Cadwallon and Penda had not simply met Edwin's charge head-on, they had drawn the Northumbrians into the worst ground and then begun to envelop them from both flanks. The enemy's smaller numbers were actually an advantage here, allowing them to maintain better cohesion while Edwin's larger force became scattered and disorganized by the terrain. A horn sounded somewhere in the distance, its mournful note cutting through the din of battle. The good knight recognized it as a Northumbrian signal, but he could not tell if it was calling for retreat, reinforcement, or simply trying to rally the scattered forces. The sound seemed to galvanize the enemy, and their attacks intensified with renewed fury. The good knight found himself fighting beside a young Northumbrian warrior whose shield arm hung useless at his side, the limb clearly broken. Despite his injury, the man continued to wield his sword with his good hand, his face set in lines of grim determination. The good knight moved to cover the warrior's weak side, his own blade weaving a deadly pattern that kept the enemy at bay. "My lord," the wounded man gasped between sword strokes. "The king! Where is the king?" The good knight glanced around, trying to spot Edwin through the chaos. For a moment, he could see nothing but the press of combat, the flash of weapons, and the spray of blood and marsh water. Then, through a gap in the fighting, he caught sight of the Northumbrian standard still flying, though it swayed dangerously as its bearer fought for his life. "There." The good knight pointed with his sword, by the standard, "but the way is blocked." Indeed, between their position and Edwin's location lay a solid wall of enemy warriors, their spears and shields forming an almost impenetrable barrier. The good knight could see that this was no accident. Cadwallon and Penda were deliberately isolating Edwin from his supporters, cutting the king off from the men who might rally to his aid. The wounded warrior beside the good knight suddenly stiffened, a Welsh spear taking him in the back. He fell forward into the marsh water, his blood spreading in dark tendrils through the murky liquid. The good knight avenged him immediately, his sword opening the spearman's throat. But the death served as a stark reminder of how desperate their situation had become. All around him, the good knight could see the signs of impending defeat. Northumbrian warriors were falling back toward the river, their formations breaking apart under the relentless pressure of the enemy advance. Some were trying to flee across the Don, but the river's banks were soft and treacherous, and many who attempted the crossing simply disappeared beneath the dark water, dragged down by the weight of their armor. The good knight's horse stumbled, its front legs sinking deep into a particularly soft patch of ground. For a terrifying moment, he thought the animal might fall, leaving him stranded on foot in the middle of the melee. But the horse recovered its footing and lunged forward, carrying him clear of the immediate danger. As he regained his balance, the good knight saw something that made his blood run cold. Edwin's standard was falling, the banner that had flown over so many victories now toppling toward the marsh water. The king's position was being overrun, and the good knight could see Edwin himself, still fighting but clearly overwhelmed by the press of enemies surrounding him. The good knight tried to force his way toward his king, but the crush of combat made progress almost impossible. Every yard gained was paid for in blood, and for every enemy he struck down, 2 more seemed to take their place. The marsh itself had become an enemy, its treacherous ground claiming men and horses with equal indifference. Through the chaos, the good knight caught glimpses of individual tragedies playing out across the battlefield. He saw a Northumbrian father and son fighting back to back until a Mercian axe separated them forever. He watched as a group of Edwin's household warriors made a desperate last stand around their wounded lord, their shields locked together, even as enemy spears found the gaps in their defense. The sound of the battle was changing too, the initial clash of armies giving way to something more desperate and personal. The war cries were becoming screams of pain and fear, the rhythmic clash of weapons replaced by the wet sounds of slaughter. The GoodKnight had heard these sounds before, in battles across the centuries, and he knew what they meant. This was no longer a battle, it was becoming a massacre. A Welsh warrior came at the GoodKnight with a long spear, the weapon's point aimed at his horse's chest. The GoodKnight deflected the thrust with his shield and struck back, but his sword met only air as the warrior danced away across the firmer ground. The man's mobility was a stark reminder of how the terrain favored the enemy. They knew this ground, had chosen it, and were using every advantage it offered. The GoodKnight's horse was tiring now, its breath coming in great gasps that sent clouds of vapor into the cold air. The animal had been fighting as hard as its rider, using teeth and hooves as weapons when the press became too close for sword work. But even the finest warhorse had limits, and the GoodKnight could feel his mount's strength beginning to ebb. Around him, the Northumbrian resistance was crumbling. Men who had stood firm in the initial charge were now looking over their shoulders, seeking escape routes that did not exist. The marsh that had hindered their attack now trapped them like a snare, offering no safe path to retreat. Those who tried to flee found themselves easy targets for enemy arrows, while those who stood and fought were gradually overwhelmed by superior numbers and position. The GoodKnight caught one last glimpse of Edwin through the melee, and what he saw filled him with a mixture of admiration and despair. The king was still fighting, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision, even as blood streamed from a dozen wounds. Osfrith was no longer beside him. The GoodKnight could see the young prince's body floating face down in the marsh water, his bright armor now dulled with mud and blood. But Edwin fought on, alone now except for a handful of his most loyal retainers. The king's face was set in lines of grim acceptance, the expression of a man who knew his fate but refused to meet it without honor. This was how kings were supposed to die, the GoodKnight thought. Not in their beds, but with sword in hand, facing their enemies to the last. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. A Mercian spear, thrown from the press of warriors surrounding the king, took Edwin in the chest. The point punched through his mail and deep into his body, and the GoodKnight saw the Northumbrian monarch stagger, his sword dropping from suddenly nerveless fingers. For a moment, Edwin remained upright, swaying like a tree in a strong wind. Then his knees buckled, and the most powerful king in Britain fell forward into the marsh water that would become his grave. The sight of their king's death broke the last of the Northumbrian resistance, and what had been a battle became a rout. The GoodKnight felt the familiar, hollow sensation that always accompanied the death of a king he had served. Edwin had been a good lord, a man who had tried to bring order and faith to a chaotic world. Now he was gone, and with him died the dream of a united Christian Northumbria that might have changed the course of history. But the GoodKnight's own survival instincts were taking over, honed by centuries of warfare. The battle was lost, Edwin was dead, and staying to die beside his fallen king would serve no purpose. The GoodKnight had learned long ago that sometimes the greatest service a warrior could perform was to live to fight another day. to carry the memory of the fallen forward into whatever future awaited. He turned his horse toward the east, where a few other survivors were attempting to escape across the Don. The river was dangerous, but it offered the only hope of avoiding the slaughter that was now consuming the battlefield. Behind him, he could hear the triumphant war cries of Cadwallon and Penda's warriors as they began the grim work of finishing off the wounded and stripping the dead. As his horse plunged into the cold water of the Don, the GoodKnight took one last look back at the battlefield. The mist was lifting now, revealing the full extent of the carnage. Bodies floated in the marsh water like fallen leaves, their blood turning the pools red in the pale morning light. The Northumbrian standard lay trampled in the mud, its proud eagle now just another casualty of war. The GoodKnight's horse struggled against the current, its hooves seeking purchase on the river bottom. Around him, other survivors fought their own battles against the water, some making it to the far bank, while others simply disappeared beneath the surface. The weight of armor that had protected them in battle now threatened to drag them to watery graves. But the GoodKnight's horse was strong, and his own will to survive was stronger. They reached the eastern bank as the sounds of slaughter continued behind them, the animal's sides heaving with exhaustion, but its legs still capable of carrying them to safety. As they climbed up onto firmer ground, the GoodKnight allowed himself one moment to mourn for Edwin, for Osfrith, for all the good men who had died in the marsh that morning. Then he turned his face toward the north, toward whatever uncertain future awaited the remnants of Edwin's kingdom. Behind him, Cadwallon and Penda were already beginning their victory celebrations, but the GoodKnight knew that this was not the end of the story. In the violent world of 7th century Britain, today's victors often became tomorrow's victims, and the wheel of fortune never stopped turning. The Battle of Hatfield Chase was over, but its consequences were just beginning. Chapter 3. The Taste of Defeat. The GoodKnight's horse stumbled up the muddy bank of the Don, water streaming from its flanks as the animal fought for solid ground beneath its hooves. Behind them, across the dark expanse of the river, the sounds of victory and slaughter continued to echo through the morning air. The triumphant war cries of Cadwallon's Welsh warriors mixed with the harsh laughter of Penda's Mercians as they moved among the fallen, finishing the wounded and claiming their grim trophies. The GoodKnight dismounted on the eastern bank, his silver armor heavy with marsh water and the weight of defeat. His horse stood with its head hanging low, sides heaving from the desperate swim across the Don. Around them, perhaps 24 other survivors had made the crossing, all that remained of Edwin's mighty host of 3,000 warriors. They stood in small groups, their faces bearing the hollow expression of men who had witnessed the destruction of everything they had fought to build. Among the survivors, the GoodKnight recognized several faces. There was Coifi, Edwin's former high priest who had converted to Christianity alongside his king, now standing knee-deep in the river reeds with his robes torn and bloodied. The old man's eyes held a haunted quality, as if he were questioning not just the outcome of the battle, but the very faith that had failed to protect his lord. Beside him stood Bassus, one of Edwin's most trusted thanes, his sword arm hanging useless at his side, the limb clearly broken during the fighting. "My lord is dead," Bassus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Edwin the Great, Bretwalda of all Britain, lies dead in that cursed marsh." The words hung in the air like a funeral dirge, and the good knight could see their impact on the other survivors. These men had served Edwin not just as king, but as the embodiment of Northumbrian power and Christian faith. His death represented more than a military defeat. It was the collapse of an entire world view, the shattering of beliefs that had sustained them through years of conquest and expansion. The good knight looked back across the Don, where smoke was beginning to rise from the battlefield. The enemy was burning the Northumbrian dead, denying them even the dignity of proper burial. Through the morning haze, he could make out figures moving among the corpses, and he knew that Cadwallon's men were taking their revenge for years of humiliation and exile. The Welsh king had promised his followers that they would feast on Northumbrian flesh, and it seemed he intended to keep that promise. "What of the prince?" asked another survivor, a young warrior whose face was streaked with blood and tears. "What of Osfrith?" The good knight had seen the prince fall, had watched Edwin's son disappear beneath the marsh water with a Welsh spear in his back. But he could not bring himself to speak the words that would confirm the young man's death. Instead, he simply shook his head, and the gesture was answer enough. The survivor who had asked the question sank to his knees in the mud, his shoulders shaking with grief. The sound of hoofbeats from the west made them all turn, hands moving instinctively to weapons that many no longer possessed. But it was not pursuit. Instead, a single rider approached under a banner of truce. The good knight recognized him as one of Cadwallon's war chiefs, a scarred veteran whose face bore the ritual tattoos of the old Welsh nobility. The messenger reined in his horse at the water's edge and called across the river in accented Latin, the common tongue of educated men in both kingdoms. "Survivors of Edwin's host, hear the words of Cadwallon ap Cadfan, rightful king of Gwynedd and now lord of these lands." The good knight and the other survivors waited in tense silence, knowing that whatever message the Welshman carried would likely determine their immediate fate. The messenger's horse pranced nervously, sensing the tension in the air, while behind him the smoke from the battlefield continued to rise like incense from some pagan altar. "King Cadwallon offers terms to those who would serve him," the messenger continued. "Lay down your arms, renounce your allegiance to the house of Edwin, and you may live to see another dawn. Continue to resist, and you will join your king in death before the sun reaches its zenith." The offer hung in the air like a poisoned gift. The good knight could see the temptation in the faces of some of the survivors. They were exhausted, outnumbered, and far from any friendly territory. Accepting Cadwallon's terms would mean survival, but it would also mean betraying everything they had fought for, everything Edwin had tried to build. Bassus was the first to respond, his voice carrying clearly across the water despite his injuries. "Tell your king that Northumbrian thanes do not kneel to Welsh dogs. We served Edwin in life, and we will serve his memory in death." The messenger's face darkened at the insult, but he maintained his composure. "So be it, but know that Cadwallon's mercy is not infinite. When next we meet, it will be with sword and spear, not words." With that, he wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward the battlefield, leaving the survivors to contemplate their grim situation. The good knight felt a mixture of pride and despair at Bassus's defiant response. The Thane had chosen honor over survival, but the good knight wondered how many of the others would make the same choice when faced with the reality of Cadwallon's vengeance. As if summoned by his thoughts, several of the younger survivors began to move away from the group, their faces filled with shame, but their steps determined. The good knight did not blame them. They had families to think of, futures that extended beyond this moment of defeat. But their departure left the remaining group even smaller, even more vulnerable to whatever retribution Cadwallon might devise. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning away the last of the mist and revealing the full extent of the carnage across the river. The good knight could see bodies floating in the marsh water, their armor glinting dully in the pale light. Among them, he knew, lay Edwin himself, the king who had united Northumbria and brought Christianity to the northern lands. Now his body would feed the ravens, and his kingdom would fall into chaos. "We cannot stay here," Coifi said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and grief. "Cadwallon will send riders to hunt us down, and this ground offers no defense." The old priest was right, but the good knight wondered where they could go. Edwin's kingdom was vast, stretching from the Humber to the Forth, but with the king dead and his army destroyed, how much of that territory would remain loyal? The bonds that held early medieval kingdoms together were personal, tied to the strength and charisma of individual rulers. With Edwin gone, those bonds would begin to unravel like a tapestry with its central thread cut. "North," Bassus said, struggling to his feet despite his broken arm. "We go north to Bamberg. If any stronghold can hold against Cadwallon, it will be the old fortress of the Bernician kings." The good knight nodded, though he harbored private doubts about their chances of reaching Bamber alive. The journey would take them through territory that might already be overrun by enemy forces, and their small band of survivors would be easy prey for any war party they encountered. But staying here meant certain death, while flight at least offered the possibility of escape. As they prepared to leave, the good knight took one last look across the dawn at the battlefield, where Edwin had made his final stand. The smoke was thicker now, and he could see figures moving among the flames, Cadwallon's warriors feeding the pyres with Northumbrian dead. The sight filled him with a cold rage that he had not felt in decades. Edwin had been a good king, a man who had tried to bring order and faith to a chaotic world. He deserved better than to have his body burned like refuse by his enemies. But rage was a luxury the good knight could not afford, not when survival demanded clear thinking and careful planning. He turned away from the river and began walking north, his silver armor catching the morning light as he led the small band of survivors away from the scene of their defeat. The countryside they passed through bore the scars of war. Smoke rose from burning farmsteads, and the roads were littered with the possessions of refugees who had fled before Cadwallon's advance. The good knight could see the fear in the faces of the few civilians they encountered. These people had lived under Edwin's protection for years, and now they found themselves at the mercy of enemies who showed no mercy at all. As they walked, the good knight found himself thinking about the nature of kingship in this violent age. Edwin had been more than just a military leader. He had been the embodiment of his people's hopes and dreams, the living symbol of Northumbrian power and Christian faith. His death would create a vacuum that ambitious men would rush to fill, and the resulting chaos would bring suffering to thousands of innocent people. The sound of hoofbeats behind them made the survivors scatter into the roadside ditches, hands reaching for weapons as they prepared for another fight. But the riders who appeared were not Cadwallan's warriors. Instead, they wore the colors of Dara, the southern portion of Edwin's kingdom. Their leader, a young man with the bearing of nobility, reined in his horse and called out in the Northumbrian dialect, "Are you survivors of Hatfield?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Bassus emerged from the ditch where he had taken cover, his good hand resting on his sword hilt. "We are. And you are?" "Osric, son of Aelfric, nephew to King Edwin," the young man replied. "I bring word from Dara. The kingdom is in chaos. Word of my uncle's death has spread like wildfire, and already the vultures gather to pick at the corpse of his realm." The good knight studied Osric's face, seeing in it the same mixture of grief and determination that marked all of Edwin's surviving kinsmen. The young man was clearly of royal blood, but he lacked the seasoned authority that had made Edwin such an effective ruler. In the violent world of 7th century politics, that inexperience could prove fatal. "What of Bernicia?" Coifi asked, voicing the question that was on all their minds. "Does Eanfrith still live?" Osric's expression darkened at the mention of Eanfrith, the son of the former Bernician king Ethelfrith, who had been living in exile during Edwin's reign. "He lives, and already moves to claim his father's throne. The kingdom splits as we speak. Bernicia and Dara go their separate ways, just as they did before Edwin united them." The news was devastating but not unexpected. The good knight had seen this pattern before, the death of a strong king followed by the immediate fragmentation of his realm as rival claimants emerged from the shadows. Edwin's great achievement, the unification of Northumbria, was already crumbling less than a day after his death. "Then we are truly alone," Bassus said, his voice heavy with despair. "Edwin's kingdom dies with him, and we are left to face Cadwallan's wrath with no lord to serve and no stronghold to defend." But Osric shook his head, his young face set in lines of grim determination. "Not alone. I ride to gather what forces I can, to make Cadwallan pay for what he has done. Edwin may be dead, but his blood still flows in the veins of his kinsmen. Will you ride with me?" The good knight could see the appeal of Osric's words to the surviving warriors. They were men without a lord, soldiers without a cause, and the young prince offered them both purpose and the chance for revenge. But the good knight had lived long enough to recognize the difference between courage and foolishness, and he feared that Osric's quest would end in nothing but more death. Still, when Bassus stepped forward to clasp the young prince's hand in acceptance, the good knight did not protest. These men needed something to believe in, some reason to continue fighting in the face of overwhelming odds. If Osric could provide that, then perhaps his cause was not entirely hopeless. As the survivors mounted the spare horses that Osric's men had brought, the good knight found himself thinking about the cyclical nature of violence in this age. Edwin's death would lead to Osric's rebellion, which would likely end in more bloodshed and suffering. The wheel of vengeance would continue to turn, grinding up the lives of kings and commoners alike in its relentless motion. but perhaps that was simply the way of the world. The good knight reflected as they rode north through the devastated countryside. Perhaps peace was nothing more than the brief pause between wars, the momentary stillness before the storm resumed its fury. He had seen enough of history to know that human nature rarely changed, that the same patterns of ambition, revenge, and violence repeated themselves across the centuries like some cosmic jest. The sun was reaching its zenith when they crested a hill and saw smoke rising from a village in the valley below. But this was not the smoke of cooking fires or forge work. This was the black, oily smoke of destruction, the signature of Cadwallon's passage through the land. As they drew closer, the good knight could see bodies scattered among the burning buildings, and he knew that the Welsh king was making good on his promise to show no mercy to Edwin's former subjects. "Animals!" Osric spat, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. "They kill women and children as readily as warriors." The good knight had seen such scenes before, in battles across the centuries, and he knew that war had a way of stripping away the veneer of civilization to reveal the beast that lurked beneath. Cadwallon's men were not inherently more evil than Edwin's had been. They were simply men intoxicated by victory and freed from the normal constraints of law and custom. In such circumstances, atrocity became commonplace, and mercy became a luxury that few could afford. They rode through the ruined village in grim silence, the horses picking their way carefully among the debris and corpses. The good knight could see the fear in the eyes of Osric's men, the growing realization of what they faced in their quest for vengeance. This was not the clean, honorable warfare of epic songs. This was the brutal reality of 7th century conflict, where victory meant the right to rape, pillage, and slaughter without restraint. As they emerged from the village and continued north, the good knight found himself wondering about the future of this troubled land. Edwin's death had created a power vacuum that would take years to fill, and in the meantime, ordinary people would suffer the consequences of their betters' ambitions. The Christian faith that Edwin had championed would face persecution under Cadwallon's rule, while the old pagan ways would reassert themselves in the chaos that followed. But the good knight had learned long ago that despair was as much a luxury as hope in times like these. His duty was not to judge the rightness or wrongness of the cause he served, but simply to survive and bear witness to the great events that shaped the world. He had stood beside Edwin in his moment of triumph, and now he would stand beside Osric in what would likely be his moment of defeat. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape as they continued their journey north. The small band of survivors and rebels united by their shared grief and their common enemy. Behind them, the smoke from the burning village continued to rise into the clear sky, a monument to the price of kings' ambitions and the cost of defeat. The good knight rode in silence, his silver armor reflecting the dying light as he contemplated the uncertain future that lay ahead. Edwin was dead. Northumbria was divided, and Cadwallon's forces were spreading across the land like a plague. But somewhere in the north, other survivors were gathering, other plans were being made, and other battles were being prepared. The wheel of fortune would turn again, as it always did. The only question was who would be crushed beneath it when it came to rest. Chapter 4. The Raven's Feast. 3 days after the Battle of Hatfield Chase, the good knight stood on a wind-swept hill overlooking the ruins of what had once been a prosperous Northumbrian settlement. The village below had been home to perhaps 200 souls, farmers, craftsmen, and their families who had lived under Edwin's protection and prospered in the peace his strong rule had brought. Now it was nothing but charred timber and scattered bones, another monument to Cadwallon's methodical destruction of everything Edwin had built. The Welsh king's army had passed through here like a plague of locusts, leaving nothing alive in their wake. The good knight could see bodies scattered among the ruins, men, women, and children who had committed no crime other than living under the wrong king's rule. Their corpses had been left unburied, food for the ravens that now circled overhead in lazy spirals, their harsh cries the only sound in the deathly silence. Beside him, Osric sat his horse with the rigid posture of a man fighting to control his emotions. The young prince's face was pale with rage and grief, his knuckles white where they gripped his reins. This had been one of his uncle's favorite villages, a place where Edwin had often stopped during his royal progresses to hear the concerns of his common subjects. Now it was a graveyard, and the man responsible was somewhere to the south, continuing his campaign of terror. "How many more?" Osric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many more villages will burn before we can stop him?" The good knight had no answer to give. In the 3 days since Edwin's death, reports had been flooding in from across Northumbria of similar atrocities. Cadwallon was not content with mere military victory. He was systematically destroying the very foundations of Northumbrian society, killing not just warriors, but farmers, priests, and children. It was a campaign of extermination, designed to ensure that Edwin's kingdom could never rise again. Behind them, the small band of survivors that had grown around Osric's banner shifted restlessly in their saddles. They numbered perhaps 50 now, a mixture of Edwin's former retainers and local thanes who had rallied to the prince's cause. It was a pitifully small force to set against Cadwallon's victorious army, but it was all they had. The good knight could see the doubt in their faces, the growing realization that their quest for vengeance might be nothing more than an elaborate form of suicide. "My lord," said Bassus, his broken arm now bound in a crude sling, "we cannot save the dead, but perhaps we can still save the living." The old thane's words carried the weight of hard experience. He had served Edwin for 20 years, had seen the kingdom grow from a collection of warring tribes into a unified realm. Now he watched it crumble with the stoic acceptance of a man who understood the cyclical nature of power. Kings rose and fell, kingdoms flourished and died, but life somehow continued in the spaces between the great events that historians would remember. Osric turned his horse away from the ruined village, his jaw set in lines of grim determination. "Then we ride north to Bamberg. If Eanfrith has truly claimed the Bernician throne, perhaps we can convince him to join our cause. Cadwallon threatens us all. Surely even he can see that." The good knight doubted that Eanfrith would be so easily convinced. The son of Ethelfrith had spent years in exile while Edwin ruled the United Kingdom, and his return to power represented a restoration of the old Bernician royal line. Why would he risk his newly reclaimed throne to avenge the death of the man who had displaced his family? political calculation would likely outweigh any sense of common cause against Cadwallon. But the good knight kept his doubts to himself as they rode north through the devastated countryside. The landscape they passed through told the story of Cadwallon's advance in stark detail. Burned farmsteads, slaughtered livestock, and the occasional pile of human bones that marked where the Welsh king's men had made an example of those who dared to resist. The very air seemed poisoned by the smoke and stench of destruction. As they crested another hill, the good knight caught sight of movement in the valley below. A column of riders was approaching from the east, their banners snapping in the wind. For a moment he thought it might be more of Cadwallon's forces, but then he recognized the colors. These were Bernician warriors riding under the raven banner of Ethelfrith's house. "Eanfrith's men," Osric said, his voice tight with tension. "Perhaps 50 riders. We could take them if we had to." But the good knight could see that the approaching warriors rode under a banner of truce, and their formation suggested negotiation rather than battle. As they drew closer, he recognized their leader, a grizzled veteran named Sigbert, who had served Ethelfrith before Edwin's rise to power. The man's face bore the scars of many battles, and his eyes held the calculating look of a survivor who had learned to adapt to changing circumstances. The two groups met in the valley between the hills, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold air. Sigbert raised his hand in greeting, but his expression remained carefully neutral. The good knight could sense the tension between the two factions, old loyalties and newer grievances creating an atmosphere thick with unspoken hostility. "Prince Osric," Sigbert said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy of diplomatic speech. "King Eanfrith sends his greetings and his condolences for the death of your uncle. Edwin was a great king, whatever our past differences." The words were polite enough, but the good knight could hear the underlying message. Eanfrith acknowledged Edwin's death, but claimed no responsibility for avenging it. The new Bernician king was more concerned with consolidating his own power than with pursuing his predecessor's enemies. "Pretty words," Osric replied, his young voice sharp with anger. "But what of deeds? Cadwallon ravages the land that was once my uncle's kingdom, and Eanfrith sits in Bamber counting his silver. Is this how the son of Ethelfrith honors the memory of a fellow king?" Sigbert's expression hardened at the implied insult, but he maintained his diplomatic composure. "King Eanfrith is concerned with protecting his own people. Bernicia has been without a king for 17 years. We cannot risk our newly restored kingdom in a war that is not ours to fight." The good knight could see the logic in Eanfrith's position, even as he understood Osric's frustration. The Bernician king was playing the long game, waiting to see how the situation developed before committing his forces. It was a cautious strategy, but perhaps a wise one given the circumstances. "Not yours to fight?" Osric's voice rose with indignation. "Cadwallon threatens all of Northumbria, Bernicia and Deira alike. Today he burns my uncle's villages, tomorrow he will come for yours." But Sigbert shook his head, his scarred face impassive. "Perhaps, but King Eanfrith believes that Cadwallon's quarrel was with Edwin personally, not with Northumbria as a whole. With Edwin dead, the Welsh king may be satisfied with his revenge." The good knight almost laughed at the naivety of that assessment. He had seen Cadwallon's face during the battle, had witnessed the pure hatred that burned in the Welsh king's eyes. This was not a man who would be satisfied with simple revenge. This was a man who sought the complete destruction of everything Edwin had represented. Cadwallon would not stop until every trace of Northumbrian power had been erased from the earth, and even then, the good knight suspected, the Welsh king's thirst for blood would remain unquenched. "You are wrong," Osric said, his voice carrying the certainty of youth and the pain of recent loss. "Cadwallon will not stop with Edwin's death. He means to destroy us all, to turn Northumbria into a wasteland where only ravens and wolves can thrive." Sigbert's expression remained unchanged, but the good knight caught a flicker of uncertainty in the veteran's eyes. Perhaps the man was not as confident in his king's assessment as he pretended to be. Perhaps he too had heard the reports of Cadwallon's atrocities, had seen the evidence of the Welsh king's systematic campaign of extermination. "King Eanfrith has made his decision," Sigbert said finally. "Bernicia will not march to war against Cadwallon. But—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "The king does not forbid individual warriors from following their own conscience. Any man who wishes to join your cause may do so, provided he renounces his oath to Bernicia first." It was a clever compromise. The good knight realized. Eanfrith could maintain his official neutrality, while still allowing his more hot-headed warriors to seek glory in Osric's doomed crusade. It would cost him nothing, and might even rid him of potential troublemakers who might otherwise challenge his authority. Several of Sigbert's men exchanged glances at their leader's words, and the good knight could see the temptation in their faces. These were warriors who had spent years in exile, dreaming of the day when they could reclaim their homeland and restore their honor. The prospect of battle, even a hopeless one, held more appeal than the tedious work of rebuilding a kingdom. But in the end, only 3 of Sigbert's riders chose to join Osric's band. The rest remained loyal to their king's cautious strategy, unwilling to risk their lives for a cause that seemed doomed from the start. The good knight could not blame them. They had families to think of, futures that extended beyond this moment of crisis. As Sigbert and his remaining men rode away toward Bamburgh, the good knight found himself studying the 3 warriors who had chosen to stay. They were young men, barely out of their teens, with the eager faces of those who had never seen real battle. They reminded him of Osfrith, Edwin's son who had died in the marsh at Hatfield Chase, and he wondered if they would live to see another winter. 53 men, Osric said, counting their small force with grim satisfaction. Not an army, but perhaps enough to make Cadwallon bleed. The good knight doubted that 53 men could do much more than provide target practice for Cadwallon's archers, but he kept his pessimism to himself. These men needed hope, however false, to sustain them through the trials ahead. And perhaps, if they were very lucky and very clever, they might accomplish something more than mere martyrdom. As they resumed their journey north, the good knight found himself thinking about the nature of heroism in this violent age. The songs that bards sang in the halls of kings celebrated warriors who died gloriously in hopeless battles, men who chose honor over survival and death over dishonor. But the good knight had lived long enough to know that such deaths, however noble, rarely changed the course of history. The world was shaped more often by survivors than by martyrs. by those who lived to fight another day, rather than those who died for lost causes. Yet there was something admirable about Osric's determination, something that spoke to the better angels of human nature. The young prince could have fled to safety in some distant kingdom, could have lived out his days in comfortable exile while Cadwallon ruled the land of his birth. Instead, he had chosen to fight, knowing that defeat was almost certain and death was likely. It was a choice that honored the memory of his uncle and the ideals that Edwin had tried to embody. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink towards the western horizon when they encountered their first refugees. A small group of civilians was struggling north along the muddy road, their possessions loaded onto a single ox cart that groaned under the weight. They were a family, a man and woman of middle years, 3 children, and an elderly grandmother who rode in the cart because her legs could no longer carry her. The man looked up fearfully as Osric's warriors approached, his hand moving instinctively to the long knife at his belt. But when he saw the Northumbrian banners, his expression changed to one of desperate hope. "My lords," he called out, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Are you Edwin's men? Have you come to drive out the Welsh devils?" Osric reined in his horse beside the cart, his young face softening with compassion. "We are what remains of Edwin's host," he said gently. "Where do you come from, good man? What news do you bring?" The refugee's face crumpled with grief and rage. "From Sancton, my lord, or what's left of it. The Welsh came 3 days ago, like demons from the pit. They killed everyone they could catch, men, women, children, even the babes in their cradles. We escaped only because my boy here saw them coming and warned us in time." He gestured toward his eldest son, a lad of perhaps 12 years, who stood beside the cart with the prematurely aged face of one who had seen too much. The boy's eyes held a haunted quality that the GoodKnight recognized from his own long experience of war. This child would carry the memory of Sancton's destruction for the rest of his life, and it would shape him in ways that his parents could not yet imagine. "How many were they?" Bassus asked, his tactical mind still functioning despite his injuries. "Did you see their banners?" "Hundreds, my lord," the refugee replied. "Maybe thousands. They carried the red dragon of Gwynedd and other banners I didn't recognize. Their leader, they said it was Cadwallon himself, the Welsh king. He rode through our village like the angel of death, pointing out which buildings to burn and which people to kill." The description sent a chill through the GoodKnight's heart. Cadwallon was not content to let his subordinates handle the work of destruction. He was personally overseeing the campaign of terror, ensuring that his vision of total annihilation was carried out to the letter. It spoke to an obsession that went beyond mere political calculation, a hatred so pure that it had become a kind of madness. "Where do you go now?" Osric asked, though the GoodKnight suspected he already knew the answer. "North, my lord, to the lands beyond the wall. They say the Picts will give shelter to Christian refugees, at least for a time. We have kinfolk there, or did once. Perhaps they will remember us." It was a desperate plan. The GoodKnight thought. The lands beyond Hadrian's wall were harsh and unforgiving, and the Picts were not known for their hospitality to strangers. But it was better than staying in Northumbria to face Cadwallon's wrath, and perhaps the family would find some measure of safety in the northern wilderness. Osric reached into his purse and pulled out a handful of silver coins, pressing them into the refugee's calloused palm. "Take this," he said. "It may help you buy passage or provisions on your journey." The man's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "God bless you, my lord. May he grant you victory over the heathen devils who have destroyed our land." As the refugees continued their journey north, the GoodKnight found himself wondering how many more such families were fleeing Cadwallon's advance. Thousands, certainly, perhaps tens of thousands. The population of Northumbria was being scattered to the winds, the social fabric that Edwin had spent decades weaving now torn apart by the Welsh king's systematic brutality. "We cannot save them all," Osric said quietly, as if reading the GoodKnight's thoughts. "But perhaps we can avenge them." The GoodKnight nodded, though he wondered if vengeance would bring any real comfort to the dead or the displaced. Still, it was something to fight for, a purpose that might give meaning to their likely deaths. And perhaps, if they were very fortunate, they might accomplish something more than mere revenge. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, they encountered more refugees, a steady stream of humanity fleeing north from Cadwallon's path of destruction. Each group brought new tales of horror, new evidence of the Welsh king's methodical campaign of extermination. Villages burned, monasteries sacked, entire families put to the sword for no crime other than living under Edwin's rule. The stories began to blur together in the GoodKnight's mind, becoming a litany of suffering that seemed to have no end. He had seen such things before, in other wars and other kingdoms, but the scale of Cadwallon's brutality was exceptional even by the standards of the 7th century. This was not the normal aftermath of battle, where victorious armies might loot and pillage before returning home. This was something darker, a deliberate attempt to erase an entire people from the face of the earth. As darkness began to fall, Osric called a halt beside a small stream that wound through a grove of oak trees. The location offered some concealment from prying eyes and fresh water for men and horses, though the GoodKnight doubted they would get much rest. The refugees' tales had left everyone on edge, and the knowledge that Cadwallon's forces might be anywhere in the surrounding countryside made sleep seem like a dangerous luxury. They made a cold camp, not daring to light fires that might betray their position to enemy scouts. The men huddled together for warmth, sharing what food they had and speaking in whispers about the day's revelations. The GoodKnight could see the doubt growing in their faces, the gradual realization that they were not riding to glorious battle, but to almost certain death. But Osric seemed oblivious to his followers' growing despair. The young prince sat apart from the others, staring south toward the lands where Cadwallon's army was spreading its reign of terror. His face was set in lines of grim determination, and the GoodKnight could see that nothing would turn him from his chosen path. Whether it was courage or foolishness, the prince would see his quest through to its bitter end. As the night deepened and the first stars appeared in the clear sky, the GoodKnight found himself thinking about the cyclical nature of history. Edwin's kingdom had risen from the ashes of earlier conflicts, had flourished for a generation, and now was falling back into chaos and violence. Somewhere in the darkness, new leaders were already emerging, new alliances were being forged, and new wars were being planned. The wheel of fortune would turn again, as it always did, grinding up the lives of kings and commoners alike in its relentless motion. But for now, In this moment between the death of one age and the birth of another, the good knight could only wait and watch and bear witness to the great events that shaped the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, and new sorrows. Tonight, he would rest as best he could and prepare for whatever fate awaited them in the days ahead. The sound of a night bird calling from the darkness reminded him that life continued even in the midst of destruction, that hope persisted even in the face of overwhelming despair. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was all any of them could ask for in this violent and uncertain world. The good knight closed his eyes and tried to sleep, his silver armor cold against his skin and his sword close at hand. Tomorrow would come whether he was ready for it or not, and with it would come new tests of courage, new opportunities for honor, and new chances to make a difference in the great tapestry of history. But tonight he would rest and remember the dead, and prepare himself for whatever trials lay ahead. Chapter 5. The Last Stand of Kings. The morning of the fourth day dawned grey and cold, with a bitter wind that cut through even the good knight's silver mail like a blade of ice. They had been riding hard since before sunrise, pushing north through countryside that grew more desolate with each passing mile. The refugees they encountered now were fewer and more desperate, their faces bearing the hollow look of people who had lost everything and expected to lose more. Osric rode at the head of their small column, his young face set in lines of grim determination that reminded the good knight painfully of Edwin in his final moments. The prince had said little since they broke camp, but his silence spoke volumes about the weight of responsibility he carried. 53 men looked to him for leadership, for hope, for some sign that their cause was not entirely hopeless. It was a burden that would have crushed many older and more experienced warriors. The landscape around them told the story of Cadwallan's systematic destruction with brutal clarity. Every village they passed had been burned, every field stripped bare, every well poisoned or filled with corpses. The Welsh king was not content with mere conquest. He was attempting to render the land itself uninhabitable, to ensure that even if his enemies survived, they would have nothing left to return to. "My lord," called Wulfstan, one of the young Bernician warriors who had joined their cause, riders approaching from the east. The good knight turned in his saddle to see a small group of horsemen cresting a distant hill. They rode hard, their mounts lathered with sweat despite the cold morning air. As they drew closer, the good knight could see that they wore the colors of Dara, and their leader bore the look of a man carrying urgent news. The messenger reined in his horse before Osric, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. "My lord prince," he gasped, "I bring word from the south. Cadwallan has turned his army toward Bamburgh. He means to take the fortress and claim the throne of all Northumbria." The news hit the small band like a physical blow. Bamburgh was the ancient seat of Bernician power, the strongest fortress north of the Humber. If Cadwallan could take it, he would control the entire kingdom and could claim legitimacy as the rightful ruler of Edwin's former realm. More immediately, it meant that Eanfrith and his warriors were in mortal danger. "How many men does he have?" Bassus asked, his tactical mind immediately grasping the implications. "Near 2,000, my lord," the messenger replied, Welsh spearmen, Mercian warriors, and others who have flocked to his banner. They move like a plague across the land, leaving nothing alive in their wake. The good knight could see the calculation in Osric's eyes as the young prince weighed their options. 53 men could not hope to face 2,000 in open battle, but perhaps they could accomplish something through stealth or cunning. The question was whether Osric's desire for vengeance would overcome his tactical sense. "How far behind us is he?" Osric asked. "Perhaps a day's march, my lord. Maybe less if he pushes his men hard." That settled it. They could not outrun Cadwallon's army, and they could not defeat it in battle. Their only hope lay in reaching Bamburgh before the Welsh king and somehow convincing Eanfrith to make a stand. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. "We ride for Bamburgh," Osric declared, his voice carrying across the small band. "If we can reach the fortress before Cadwallon, we may yet turn the tide of this war." The good knight doubted that their arrival would make much difference to the fortress's defenses, but he kept his skepticism to himself. These men needed hope, however false, to sustain them through the trials ahead. And perhaps, if they were very lucky, they might accomplish something more than mere martyrdom. They rode hard through the morning, pushing their horses to the limit as they raced against time and the approaching enemy. The countryside flew past in a blur of burned villages and empty fields, each mile bringing them closer to what might be their final battle. The good knight could feel his mount's strength beginning to ebb, but the animal responded gamely to his urging, its hooves pounding out a desperate rhythm on the muddy road. As the sun reached its zenith, they crested a hill and saw Bamburgh in the distance. The ancient fortress stood on its rocky promontory like a defiant fist raised against the sky, its walls dark against the grey clouds that gathered overhead. Even from this distance, the good knight could see the banners flying from its towers. The raven of Ethelfrith's house still flew over the stronghold of the Bernician kings, but as they drew closer, the good knight began to notice disturbing details. There were too few guards on the walls, too little activity in the courtyards below. The fortress had the look of a place under siege, though no enemy army was yet visible on the surrounding plains. "Something is wrong," Bassus muttered, voicing what they were all thinking. The fortress should be bustling with activity, preparing for Cadwallon's assault. Instead, it looks half dead. They were challenged at the gates by nervous guards who seemed surprised to see armed men approaching from the south. The sentries wore the colors of Bernicia, but their faces held the hollow look of men who had received terrible news. After a brief exchange of words, the gates swung open to admit Osric's small band, and they rode into the courtyard of the ancient fortress. What they found there confirmed the good knight's worst fears. The courtyard was filled with warriors, but they stood in small groups with the aimless manner of men who had lost their purpose. Their weapons hung loose in their hands, and their eyes held the vacant stare of those who had witnessed something that defied comprehension. A figure emerged from the great hall, Sigbert, the same veteran who had carried Eanfrith's message to them days earlier. But the man who approached them now bore little resemblance to the confident diplomat they had met in the valley. His face was ashen, his movements those of a man walking in a nightmare. "Prince Osric," Sigbert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You come too late. The King Eanfrith is dead." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through Osric's small band. The good knight felt a familiar chill run down his spine. He had heard such announcements too many times before, had witnessed the moment when hope died and despair took its place. "How?" Osric demanded, his young voice cracking with emotion. "Was it battle? Did Cadwallan's army reach the fortress before us?" Sigbert shook his head, his scarred face twisted with shame and grief. "Not battle, my lord. Treachery. The king went to treat with Cadwallan under a banner of truce. He thought he could negotiate, could find some way to preserve his kingdom without bloodshed." The good knight closed his eyes, knowing what was coming next. He had seen this pattern before, the naive king who believed in honor and diplomacy, the ruthless enemy who saw such beliefs as weakness to be exploited. The outcome was always the same. "Cadwallan received him with all courtesy," Sigbert continued, his voice growing stronger as anger began to replace grief. "They feasted together, spoke of peace and mutual respect. And then, when the king's guard was down, when he believed himself safe under the laws of hospitality, Cadwallan had him murdered, cut down like a dog in the very tent where they had shared bread and wine." The silence that followed was deafening. The good knight could hear the wind whistling through the fortress walls, the distant cry of seabirds, the soft sobbing of a woman somewhere in the shadows. But from the warriors in the courtyard came no sound at all. They were too stunned, too horrified by the magnitude of Cadwallan's betrayal to find words. "When?" Bassus asked finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Yesterday at sunset," Sigbert replied. A few of his escort escaped to bring word. They say Cadwallan laughed as the king died, said that this was how he dealt with all who stood in his way. The good knight felt a cold rage building in his chest, a fury that had nothing to do with politics or loyalty and everything to do with the violation of the most sacred laws of warfare. Even in this violent age, there were rules that civilized men observed. The sanctity of truce banners, the protection of envoys, the basic courtesies that made negotiation possible. Cadwallan had shattered all of these with a single act of treachery. "Then we are truly alone," Osric said, his voice barely audible. "Edwin dead, Eanfrith murdered, and Cadwallan's army approaching. What hope do we have now?" But before anyone could answer, a new voice cut through the despair like a sword through silk. "We have the hope that comes from righteous anger, nephew, the hope that burns in the hearts of men who have nothing left to lose." The good knight turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows of the great hall, a tall man in his 30s, wearing mail that had seen hard use and carrying a sword that bore the nicks and scratches of many battles. His face was lean and weathered, marked by years of exile and hardship. But his eyes burned with a fierce intelligence that reminded the good knight of Edwin in his prime. "Oswald," Osric breathed, recognizing the newcomer. "But I thought you were in Iona, studying with the monks." Oswald, son of Ethelfrith and brother to the murdered Eanfrith, stepped into the courtyard with the confident stride of a born leader. "I was," he said simply. "But God called me home to face this crisis. I arrived this morning, just hours after word of my brother's death reached the fortress. The good knight studied this new arrival with interest. He had heard of Oswald during Edwin's reign, the exiled prince who had spent years among the Irish monks, learning their ways and their faith. But the man who stood before them now was no gentle scholar. This was a warrior who had been forged in the fires of adversity, tempered by years of waiting and planning for his moment to reclaim his birthright. "What do you propose?" Sigbert asked, and the good knight could hear the desperate hope in the veteran's voice. Here, at last, was someone who might be able to lead them out of the darkness that had engulfed Northumbria. Oswald's smile was cold as winter steel. "I propose that we give Cadwallon the war he so desperately wants, but we will fight it on our terms, not his." He gestured toward the walls of the fortress, where the good knight could now see more activity as word of the prince's arrival spread. "Bamberg is strong, but it is not impregnable. Cadwallon has 2,000 men and the momentum of victory. If we try to hold these walls, he will eventually break us through sheer weight of numbers." "Then what?" Osric asked, his young face showing the first glimmer of hope it had held in days. "We abandon the fortress," Oswald said calmly, ignoring the gasps of shock from the assembled warriors. "We take every man who can hold a spear, and we march south to meet Cadwallon in the field. But we choose the ground, we choose the time, and we fight with the fury of men who have been pushed beyond endurance." The good knight could see the tactical wisdom in Oswald's proposal, even as he recognized its desperate nature. A mobile force could strike where the enemy was weak, could use knowledge of the local terrain to offset Cadwallon's numerical advantage. But it would also mean abandoning the strongest fortress in Northumbria, giving up the one place where they might have held out against a siege. "It is madness," one of the Bernician thanes protested. "Bamberg has never fallen to assault. Why abandon it now?" Oswald's eyes blazed with conviction as he answered, "Because walls cannot win wars, only men can. And because I have seen a vision of victory that will come not from hiding behind stone and timber, but from meeting our enemies with courage and faith." The good knight had heard such claims before, from kings and prophets who believed themselves chosen by the gods or God for great deeds. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they were deluded, and sometimes the distinction mattered less than the effect their conviction had on their followers. Looking at the faces of the warriors around him, the good knight could see that Oswald's words were having the desired effect. Despair was giving way to determination, defeat to defiance. "How many men can we muster?" Bassus asked, his tactical mind already working on the practical details. "Perhaps 800 from Bamberg's garrison," Sigbert replied. "Maybe 200 more from the surrounding countryside, if we can gather them quickly enough." 1,000 men against 2,000. Oswald mused. Poor odds, but not impossible. David faced worse when he stood against Goliath. The biblical reference was not lost on the good knight. Oswald was casting their struggle in religious terms, making it not just a political conflict, but a holy war between Christian and pagan, between the forces of light and darkness. It was a powerful narrative, one that might inspire men to fight beyond their normal limits. "When do we march?" Osric asked, and the good knight could hear the eagerness in the young prince's voice. "Here, At last was the chance for the glorious battle he had been seeking. "Tomorrow at dawn," Oswald replied. "We will meet Cadwallon at Hatfield, where the old Roman wall crosses the military road. The ground there favors defense, and the symbolism will not be lost on our men. We make our stand where the ancient empire once held back the barbarians." The GoodKnight knew the place Oswald spoke of, a ridge of high ground near Hadrian's Wall, where the old Roman fortifications still stood as monuments to a vanished age. It was indeed good defensive terrain, but it would also trap them if the battle went badly. There would be no retreat from Hatfield, no second chances if Oswald's plan failed. But as he looked around the courtyard at the faces of the assembled warriors, the GoodKnight could see that retreat was not on their minds. These men had been pushed beyond the point where survival mattered more than honor. They had seen their kings murdered, their homes burned, their families scattered to the winds. Now they wanted only the chance to strike back at their tormentors, to make Cadwallon pay for his crimes, even if it cost them their lives. "Then we have work to do," Sigbert said, his voice regaining some of its old authority. "Weapons to sharpen, armor to mend, prayers to say. If we are to die tomorrow, let us at least die well." As the warriors dispersed to make their preparations, the GoodKnight found himself alone with Oswald in the courtyard. The prince was staring south toward the lands where Cadwallon's army was approaching, his face set in lines of grim determination. "You think I am mad," Oswald said, without turning around. "You think this is a fool's errand that will end in nothing but more death?" The GoodKnight considered his words carefully before answering. "I think you are a man who has been given an impossible task and is trying to make the best of it. Whether that makes you mad or wise, only tomorrow will tell." Oswald smiled at that, an expression that transformed his weathered features. "Spoken like a true philosopher. Tell me, knight, how many battles have you seen? How many kings have you watched rise and fall?" "More than I care to count," the GoodKnight replied honestly. "Enough to know that victory often goes to the side that wants it most, regardless of numbers or odds." "Then perhaps we have a chance after all," Oswald said. "Because I have never wanted anything more than I want to see Cadwallon pay for what he has done to our people." The GoodKnight nodded, understanding the fire that burned in the prince's eyes. He had seen that same flame in Edwin's gaze during his greatest victories, had witnessed the power that came from absolute conviction wedded to tactical skill. Perhaps Oswald was right. Perhaps tomorrow would bring not defeat but redemption. As the sun began to set over the ancient fortress, the GoodKnight made his own preparations for the battle to come. He checked his weapons, mended a tear in his mail, and said what prayers he could remember from his long existence. Tomorrow would bring either victory or death, and he wanted to be ready for either outcome. The night passed slowly, filled with the sounds of men preparing for war, the ring of hammer on anvil, the whisper of whetstones on steel, the low murmur of voices reciting prayers or sharing final words with comrades. The GoodKnight slept little, his mind turning over the events that had brought them to this point and the choices that lay ahead. When dawn finally came, grey and cold, it found 1,000 warriors assembled in Bamber's courtyard, their faces set with the grim determination of men who had accepted their fate. At their head stood Oswald, no longer the exiled prince, but a king in all but name, his presence transforming a desperate rabble into something that might yet be called an army. "Today we march to Hatfield," Oswald declared, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled host. "Today we face the enemies of our people and our faith. Some of us may not see another sunset, but all of us will have the chance to strike a blow for justice and honor." He raised his sword toward the lightening sky, and the blade caught the first rays of the rising sun. "For Northumbria, for our fallen kings, for the God who watches over the righteous." The answering roar from 1,000 throats shook the very stones of the ancient fortress, and the GoodKnight felt his own voice joining the battle cry. Whatever happened at Hatfield, it would not be said that they went to their fate in silence. The gates of Bamberg swung open, and the army of the dispossessed marched out to meet their destiny. Behind them, the fortress stood empty for the first time in centuries, its walls echoing with the ghosts of kings and the memories of better days. Ahead lay Hatfield and Cadwallon, and the battle that would determine the fate of Northumbria. The GoodKnight rode with them, his silver armor gleaming in the morning light, ready to witness whatever history would write in blood and steel on the pages of this new day. Our GoodKnight will return. Subscribe for more.